Well, good afternoon, everybody. We'll make a start. So the title of today's session is Leading on Remote Learning. My name's Rune Webb. I'm a Regional Innovations Lead for East Anglia, and I work as an Assistant Head at Cavalry Primary School in March. When I'd finished creating this presentation, I sort of regretted the title immediately because the connotations of remote learning are perhaps for some that this is all going to come to an end at some point. So I wish I'd called it digital learning. So if we can just imagine that is what it's called, that'd be really helpful as we go through it. And that links really nicely to the session that Ellen Burgess ran earlier about the difference between pedagogy and digital pedagogy. I think there's similarities here that actually it's about learning and how we can use systems generally, but they're very applicable to a remote environment. If you didn't see that earlier, I highly recommend checking that out when the videos are available on YouTube later. And just to touch then really on the point that Ellen made, it's worth defining pedagogy from the outset, and that quote that it's the heart of teaching, it's the rules and principles that guide effective and efficient activities which lead to learning. And in this context, we're trying to facilitate that remotely through the use of digital tools. And as we also touched upon earlier today, our brains don't learn differently in remote education. So everything we know about cognitive science, about how we learn, it all still applies. We don't have to make huge changes to the way that we teach. So for context, now this is going to be really applicable to remote learning, potential for partial closure, bubble closures, isolating pupils. Going forward, the applications for homework, catch-up tutoring, extending curricular opportunities and home learning, and then that hybrid teaching and learning environment where we can start to use really innovative practice encompassing technology and more traditional methods hand in hand, really leveraging the advantages of each in the most appropriate way. When I was asked to do this session, it did very much occur to me that when we talk about leadership, it can strike that image of somebody who really knows what they're doing inside out, has got all the answers. And I've been reading Imperfect Leadership by Steve Mumby, which is by no means a manual about leadership, but it's a series of tales and anecdotes about his time at the National College and how he developed his ethos as a leader. And there's this quote here which really, really struck with me. So I'll just give you a moment to read that. So moving on, then the structure of today is going to be very loosely based around the 7 levers for leadership. Now, this was something that was highlighted to me, and I'll go on to the source of that shortly. But what I really wanted to start by saying is that I'm not going to profess to be a great leader or even a very good one. I haven't got the answers to the really challenging questions. However, I think one of the key skills of leadership, and I've been very fortunate in my privileged position where I've get to see this practice in lots of different schools and different contexts, is the opportunity to observe what works well, to think about key questions, and to give ourselves the time and space to think about our schools, our teams, and the context we work in, and think about what systems and structures, what techniques and questions we can use to lead others effectively. And that doesn't mean that we need to have the answers. If you're sitting there thinking, or you come away from today, there's 1 or 2 things that are really useful, that's absolutely fantastic. If you get to the end of today's session and you think, well, I knew all of that, that's absolutely fantastic as well. I think sometimes just hearing that other people are thinking the same way that you are, or that there's similarities between yourself and the other practice that we get exposed to today, it can be really reassuring, can't it? So I hope that everybody will take something away from it. 7 levers for leadership. And so I found these on a blog by a gentleman called Joe Kirby after I'd been directed to them, and they get divided into 2 sections, the instructional and the cultural. They're just a useful framework for dividing up all of the different things that we naturally do as leaders and giving us headings and hangers and language to talk about them with a little bit of common understanding. So it is very loosely based on this today. This will form our agenda. However, I have combined some and skipped over some where I felt it was most appropriate for this context. So broadly then, it got me thinking, what are the aims of a leader in any scenario? And it's something I've been mulling over for a long time, and actually links really nicely to the document that Ellen shared from the National College for Leadership. And I've summed this up, this is paraphrased, but it's effectively, it's about doing, knowing, and asking why. So we want to help all to do better. That's staff, pupils, organisations, the country as a whole. It's our moral imperative, isn't it? Knowing, helping everybody to know more. And that's not just learning by rote, but that's the skills of evaluation and summarising and synthesising, all those key critical thinking skills that we encourage pupils and staff to develop. And then the why, making sure we all know why we do what we do. It's the difference between knowledge and wisdom is absolutely key. And then it's an evolving situation in which we're doing this leadership at the moment. And actually, it's evolving more rapidly at the moment, but it's always an evolving situation that we're doing this in. Usually we're able to take a slightly more longitudinal view because the pace of change is less. Currently, we don't really know what it might look like in 5 weeks, let alone 5 months. But actually, it's the same thing that needs to be at the heart of that. And the School's Guide to Implementation online from the EEF had this statement. And actually, I thought it's really, really good to hold that in mind as we go through and look at effective leadership. So the first of those levers was to be data-driven. Now, this is a term that I first heard in business, and I have to profess I didn't really know what it meant. I got the kind of gist of it, and so we're going to unpick that slightly. And there are 5 stages here, really. So I'll just give you a moment to look at that chart. Apologies for the resolution, it's the best I could find. So I wonder where you might identify you are on that journey to being data-driven. Most of us work in an environment where data does inform practice, but is it really at the heart of all the decision making within our organisations? And I just at this point would like to bring up that doesn't just mean quantitative data, statistical numbers, etc. I believe that qualitative data, people voice, staff surveys, parent surveys, all of our informal and formal observations in schools, that's just as valid as data and can sit at the heart of decision making. But it's making sure we're always using that data to make our decisions. And it links in really nicely with the step 1 of the EEF's implementation process, because it's through analysing that data that we will be able to identify as leaders our key priorities that are amenable to change. Without that, we may well be trying to change the wrong thing or have picked a priority that actually isn't amenable to change. It's a really, really key point. And then thinking about data and in that implementation cycle, it's important that everybody has a common understanding of data. Something that I have witnessed at times and certainly experienced myself is that the owners of the data, the people who create it, have a really good and clear understanding of what it is the data is doing, telling, showing, how they collected and collated it, how they evaluated it. But actually, when that data is shared outside of that immediate context, it becomes less clear to others. So making sure that everybody involved in the key decision making has got a common understanding of that data so that you're getting multiple views when you're making your critical decisions. Deciding who is the data for, how will it be collected in a way that isn't too onerous? How will the quality of the data be evaluated? Who will analyse it and how? And then from that, distilling key priorities and communicating them succinctly. And again, there's questions there to consider. What forum will that be communicated in? Is it for discussion? And how will you decide out of all the things that it's telling you what the next steps already are? So then there's 2 kind of key bits of data in the quantitative style. I think you get those headline datas where there's summarizing going on. There's perhaps averages masking things that are happening, although very useful. And then you get the more granular data. So here I've just given 2 examples where you might be looking at engagement currently, and what that looks like is headline figures, but actually what does that look like for individual pupils at the really, really granular level? Why is it that the PP child perhaps has got less engagement than somebody else? Because those questions aren't going to come up necessarily for individuals in the headlines. And I sometimes think this is where there can be some resistance to data because of the empathetic nature of our jobs, because of the difficult circumstances and the vulnerabilities of many of the children and families we work with are in. There can be a tension that sometimes people believe that data masks those human aspects of it. But I actually think it's the other way around. I think that through data, using kind of headlines and granularity appropriately, it actually helps you to not lose track of any of those vulnerabilities and those human aspects that are so integral to the job that we do as leaders and supporting our colleagues in the classroom to do. So then once you've got that data, what is it telling you? And so I've got a little activity here for you, please. So here I've got a collection of data by year group across the top row and then by categories down the sides. And then it's telling you the percentage of those children in a year group who aren't engaged. So in the chat, if you can, another waterfall activity, those of you that have been in sessions already today will be used to those. Can you please type, but not press enter, what you think the key message from some part of that data is and what is it telling you? And I'll just give you a couple of moments to think about that and pop that in. So for example, just in case I wasn't clear, you might be thinking there's a real issue there in year 5 for disadvantaged children, and judging by the percentage, possibly specifically not boys for once. It looks like it could be a gender balance there. Okay, if you've got something to pop in the chat, then if you can press enter, please. And we'll have a look at some of those thoughts. Yeah, some really good questions there. Nice that people are pulling out positives as well. I do think as leaders, sometimes we can fall into the trap of looking at where there are next steps and areas to address, and celebrating, the positives is absolutely vital, isn't it? Key to keeping people feeling motivated and like they're being effective with change. Yeah, interesting observation about the higher engagement in the younger years. Yeah, and good question there from Joe about the overlap of groups. I always think it's quite interesting when you're looking at data like this. Very often I go low tech and I get 3 hoops from the PE cupboard and I write their names on post-its of the different categories, and I overlap the hoops like a Venn diagram and place them in there because it's a really good visual representation of where the children are. And you can then take their names and post-its and decide exactly what you're going to do with them. I'm sure there's a very slick digital way of doing that too. Yeah, and great, Nadine, there. It's suggesting actions that possibly could be taken. Thank you. Right, we're going to move on then. So at the end of each section, I've tried to include some key questions that I think are really helpful as a leader. And the first one I always ask myself when dealing with data, and I've seen lots of other people doing this really successfully, is why am I collecting that data? Data for data's sake is not helpful. You can get that kind of sensation of data drowning, can't you? And then asking yourself, what do I want to learn from it? Because actually, knowing what you want to learn from it can be a really good steer about what type of data you might collect and where you might collect it from, and then how will it be used. There's no good collecting data and then not acting upon the key priorities that you identify. That's not to say that you can address everything that the data is telling you, because you do have to prioritize the limitations with resource and particular focuses that we have for lots of different reasons, but knowing what you'll do with it is key. So then instruction planning, which is about delivering well-structured lessons with the right content delivered effectively. There are a couple of quotes there, which I'll just give you a moment to read. And I think considering the wider impact that familiarity and consistency bring, I often think there's a competency and familiarity. And this is the bit that I have to say is the legacy that I'm perhaps most excited about, and looking at how our practice that's developed in remote education, as a leadership team across the trust, we can move forward within our schools. And I like to think about, what does it look like when you've got consistency across a single class, where every single lesson they're familiar with the structure and the dual coding and all of the things that are going to support them in doing it. And then what does that look like when you go across a year group or a phase or a key stage or even across the school? And the across the school one really gets me thinking. So a child in year 3 who's gotten really familiar with how Mr. Higgins delivers his lessons is then moving up to Miss Smith and finding that she delivers hers in a completely different way. And that cognitive load, then they're worrying or considering what's going to be coming next and how is it going to be delivered and will they be able to access it, as well as trying to engage with the content of the learning, the academic progress. Whereas if there's a familiarity to it, I think that's really powerful and significantly reduces that cognitive load. And then scale that up again. What does that look like when it's across a whole school? What does that look like when it's across a whole area or indeed a whole trust possibly? So then it's considering a framework, isn't it? And I'm not saying that the framework we've got is necessarily the one that does lend itself to being used both remotely and in class, although I think it probably does. And as Nick said, it's a platform for innovation. If we start here with this commonality, we can become really, really inventive with what we're doing. And actually, as staff, as leaders, if we equip our teams to use frameworks like this one, it reduces their cognitive load. They stop worrying about how to structure their lessons effectively and can start thinking about specifically what is the content and spending more energy on how they're going to teach it. Where are the high quality models going to come from? And I think that's really, really powerful. And then during this time, it's about reminding staff to be kind to themselves and that they do know what they're doing. There's quotes we've seen throughout today. Fundamentally, teaching and learning is the same set of science and skills that we need to do it, whether we're in school or whether we're at home. And staff know how to teach concepts. The challenge for them is to take the next steps and adapt them for the new context that we're going to be operating in. We all learn by assimilating new information in what we already know, our schemas. And this is just as true for colleagues as it is for pupils. Acknowledging that it will take longer to cover the curriculum in a remote environment. I believe staff need to hear that from the leaders in schools, so that they have permission to take smaller steps and ensure that learning is secure, without feeling that pressure that they've got to cover the same breadth of curriculum in the same period of time they would. What perhaps took 5 lessons to cover in a classroom might possibly take 6 or 7 when delivered remotely. And those small steps are the key to enabling them to do that. The next thing that can be used to support staff in instruction planning is local policy and guidelines. So ensuring that staff are familiar with and have access to all of the types of documents that are going to enable them to not have to think about how those things work and concentrate on how those things impact on the quality of teaching. So I'm just going to come out presenting my screen and click on a couple of these links. So where possible, I've tried to use real examples, and elsewhere I've borrowed from the Key for Leaders, because I think that's always an excellent resource to start with. So remote learning policies. I've highlighted here that it includes things like engagement and attendance, engagement with parents, when pupils are added to provision, safeguarding curriculum, progress and access. And you can see here, if it loads, beg your pardon, I've got very slow internet where I am today. They've got a similar list here, and it just goes through step by step, laying out where you'd need to adapt this for your school, as I'm sure many of you already have, and where there are things that can remain the same. I think this is a vital document because it is a different way of working in supporting all staff knowing what their responsibilities and roles are, and actually that will alleviate some of the stress from them if it's really clearly laid out, something like this. So you'll get these resources later and you can have a look at that link. There's a further example there of one that's been completed for a school. And then the lesson framework, those of you that have been in Nick's session earlier today will be familiar with. I'm not going to go through that now, but there's a really, really in-depth guide to using the framework there that I've touched upon already. That's excellent. An online safety policy. So I've just got an example here of the TFAT one. And again, it's just been updated to reflect how we're working at the moment. It's ensuring, again, that children and staff are aware of where they can go for help, and in a situation where we're loaning out IT equipment, that everybody is familiar with what's acceptable use. So on the back of that, you'd be perhaps looking at your acceptable use policies and ensuring that everybody was familiar with those. Marking policies. Again, these take away the need for staff to consider for themselves, although it'd be great if they were part of the consultative process as this was developed in each school, of what is required for marking. So this example is from our virtual school, but it just sets out exactly what it is that staff who've got that responsibility need to do to effectively support children in moving their learning on. I think that's a great resource for all schools. And then knowing where they can go for support, whether that's how-to videos, technical support, whether that's pastoral support. It's really, really vital that staff feel supported during this challenging way of working, and know where to go for help. For the technical support, we've of course got our fantastic YouTube channel, but because some things are individual to schools, I just wanted to share with you one idea I'd had and have implemented in our school, and I'm sure lots of other places have too. It's just a self-help kind of kiosk website where staff can go and watch video tutorials about how to do some of the most common tasks in school. And this has two effects, really. I think it's really enabling for staff to feel like actually they can problem solve for themselves, but also as a leader in school, it means I can refer people to it, and I'm not necessarily having a significant amount of my time taken up doing the same demonstrations repeatedly. It's an efficiency, definitely. I think the first one about empowering people to solve problems themselves is the key one there. So just come back to the presentation, bear with me. Again, key questions. Do staff feel confident in what's required of them? I think your remote learning policy is key there, and also any other policies in school. Do staff feel empowered and know they have permission to make key pedagogical decisions? Obviously, that needs to be in consultation with leadership, but they do need to make decisions differently, not necessarily, like I said, going to cover the same content in the same period of time. To know where to go to get help. And then an idea that I've seen implemented in several schools really, really usefully, and doesn't even have to be somebody in the school, sometimes it's just a colleague somewhere else, is a critical friend. When you're developing a resource or when you're considering a pedagogical point, just having that conversation, either written or verbally, about it can really help clarify your thinking. Observation and feedback. It's a vital part of the teaching and learning process, but I think it probably needs thinking about slightly differently in this context. So how can we effectively collect, observe and record evidence? How do we sort that evidence in relation to key development priorities of the school and of the individual? How do we interpret that evidence? So what is it telling us? How does that align again with our priorities? And then providing feedback. So using that evidence in discussions with the individual or the group that's been responsible for those lessons. It's different in this environment. There are some advantages. So if we're looking at asynchronous provision, there's the potential for observation and feedback to happen asynchronously. Quite often we're constrained in schools by the timetabling of the day. Well, when we've got asynchronous provision, we've got access to the lessons that are being delivered around the clock. So actually we're able to sit down with multiple members of staff and look through a lesson and have different points of view and discussion, whereas during the school day it can be very difficult to release a significant number of staff to watch. I think that's really powerful, and it makes me think about the opportunity for using things like triads and lesson studies in this time. And that you can see that here in the key questions. I shan't read them all out to you, I'll just give you a moment to read through them yourselves, taking a leaf out of Nick's book. The one I would just highlight to you is the coaching-based support structure. There are some fantastic CPD opportunities this year in terms of coaching development. I've just begun that, and I know some people in our school have already completed it. It's been a real eye-opener, and I know as a leadership team we're considering the impact it's going to have and how we can best deploy it. So if that's something you're interested in, I really would encourage you to look at the Eventbrite site and see if there's any upcoming sessions that you can sign up for. And then professional development. I think once we all got over the initial shock of the new way in which we needed to work, and we'd gotten the mechanics of what we were doing established, we all started to think about our professional development again. And there's a key quote from the EEF here about technology can become a solution in search of a problem. I think it's really, really worth bearing in mind. Not just with technology, actually. I think there's a great number of people and organisations offering seminars, webinars, as a, it is a key opportunity during this time for people to attend CPD, but I think it needs to be approached through the lens of identified key priorities. How is that going to move forward something that we know is a priority in school? And to that end, I found this grid online as I was looking for it. It's an evaluation tool. So just two axes, one labelled with the usability for staff, one with outcomes for students, and then we've got our 4 quadrants. And actually taking a resource or a training opportunity and popping it onto where we believe or where there's evidence particularly to support what impact it's going to have can really help us make a decision about whether it's something we should use or not, whether it's something we kind of mandating perhaps or very, very actively encouraging, or whether it's something we're saying, look, we don't think that's an effective something to use, please don't use it. Just give you a moment to look at that. And again, I think to be used effectively, it's great if those conversations where the evaluation happening are in a forum where staff members can be involved. So it might be phase meetings, staff meetings, informal conversations. The other way that I think this could be really, really well used is where we find innovative practice in our colleagues or in our schools or outside of our schools, if we're lucky enough to see it, and using this tool to support staff evaluating it and amplifying the voice and the practice of the individual that's innovating, and demonstrating on here that actually, it's a highly usable something that improves outcomes for students significantly. Can be a great model for looking at that. Give just a moment to read those 2 quotes. And I included those 2 images specifically because there's 2 things there really. One is sometimes we already possess the tool with which to solve the problem. The other thing is that sometimes by going for something that's significantly more complex or requires a greater amount of resources, we actually exclude people from participating in it. Either the requisite knowledge or prerequisite knowledge they require to access it might be a barrier to them. It might be about access to resource, whether that's time or money or particularly in this context, access to devices. So where there is a simpler tool that we're all familiar with and it does the job effectively, that often might be the best choice. That's particularly true when we're considering our broad and balanced curriculum. And I think one of the things I've really loved to see during this period is the innovative practice with which people have developed resources that all can access to deliver specialist lessons. The example we saw of the music classroom earlier today in the Bitmoji. I've seen some really marvelous use of digital manipulatives in maths and lots more. Again, some key questions there. I'll just give you a moment to read. Okay, moving on. So then we're on to our second section of levers. This is about cultural levers. And just very simply, I just wanted to identify that I think there are 3 really key stakeholders in this. And then it's actually only where we effectively overlap all elements of that as best we can. That's where we get really effective remote learning or a really effective use of digital tools. in school. When children are learning at home, they're outside of our systems and structures that we've carefully finessed over a number of years to ensure and assist them to make the greatest progress they can. What we're left with are relationships, the relationships that teachers have already established with the pupils, the relationships that pupils generally have with school and their perception of it, and then the relationships between the pupils and the parents and the teachers and the parents. And then what we need to do, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that we have to think about how we can build or strengthen those relationships, in some cases forge them where they've not been positive before, and utilize them to support the children as best we can. So here's where I've combined a couple of the key levers, because I did think there's a really significant overlap, that what was true for students was also often true for staff and the parent culture as well. Very often, parents are really well-intentioned and asking really insightful questions, but because of the fact that sometimes we overhear it as they come to the door, or it might be on social media, it doesn't always give us the forum to address it. An example of this might be the pressure some schools have experienced to deliver what they perceive to be live teaching, synchronous teaching. And actually what I've discovered is, when we've had examples of that, explaining the rationale behind it, the strategic decision and why we've made that to deliver predominantly in an asynchronous way, although we're starting to explore the advantages of the synchronous, they've actually gone away and they've become a mouthpiece, a fountain for spreading that. And I've seen online them challenging other parents really politely and supportfully about why the schools have made those decisions. So it's about engaging them as much as we can and ensuring that all staff are familiar with why those strategic decisions have been made and understand the points, because they are the front line. They are often the ones that are kind of doorstepped, hopefully at 2 meters, by the parents as they're dropping children off. And if they're equipped to deal with that, that's really excellent. And actually, to some extent as well, the students, involving this, particularly the older children, in understanding why we're delivering lessons or making any decision in the way that we are, is key, because they are also our key stakeholder and are able to provide that kind of information to the parent at home if they're not overly engaged. So all of these relationships are built upon with systems and structures that already exist, and it's a thinking about how we can move those online. So it got me thinking as to what were the things that we needed to ensure that all of these stakeholders felt comfortable in using in a new way. So the school's ethos and values, it's very evident as you walk around schools and look at display boards or posters outside, the attitude of staff, children, what the ethos and values of schools are. We need to try and recreate that in our online spaces. So that's having somewhere where communication can happen. It's about delivering explicitly those things that are implicit within the building in terms of attitudes. And it's about supporting, celebrating, and challenging in appropriate ways. Promoting success, so identifying where within school staff are going above and beyond where children are, and actually where parents are too, and sharing that in a way that's really appropriate. I know an initiative that I've seen in a couple of schools prior to the situation we're in now is the positive phone call home. Actually, that's been more important than ever, that when we're doing those weekly phone calls home, it's not just an opportunity to chase those that aren't engaging. It's finding really meaningful reasons to celebrate success, however small that is, because that gives us a starting point for building that relationship out further. And it's about giving everybody a voice. Again, there are some key questions there. I'll just give you a moment to read. Okay, and then I've got an activity. I've no doubt that on this call today, we have got a wealth of experience between us about how to effectively engage parents, because I think this has perhaps been one of our greatest challenges. So I've got a link to a Jamboard, which I'm just going to drop into the chat. And I wondered if we could all contribute on a sticky note to this Jamboard and share some of the fantastic practice that's out there. So hopefully that's going to work. It should be in the chat now for you. Please shout if you have any difficulty accessing it. Voice view only, I beg your pardon. Bear with me just a second. There you go, I've reshared it with edit permissions, I beg your pardon. Brilliant. I can see so many things there, some of which we've definitely employed ourselves, and actually a few others there that have given me some points to think about. That's really, really wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to give you 30 seconds more and then I'm going to go back to the presentation. Yeah, really interesting one there about the welfare calls to parents to see how they are doing. I think often we're so focused on the children, aren't we? But that's certainly been key. You know, if the parents aren't coping, they're not going to be well equipped to support their children. Yeah, the translating one, that's really interesting. I noticed that there's a script you can use in Google Slide to translate either into a selection of languages, or you can adapt it so that they're only able to select one, which is great if it's, you know, simplifying the use of it. So yeah, that's really, really key, isn't it? Just means they haven't got to leave the presentation that you're sharing with them to use Google Translate and copy and paste it if their computer skills aren't necessarily particularly high. Yeah, it's wonderful. Right, I'm going to pop back to the presentation. Thank you for that. That'll be a great resource to come back to later. And then the last thing I wanted to touch upon really was to finish up with, and this one is quite personal. It's something I've struggled with throughout this period as a leader, and I certainly think it's true of other leaders in our school and beyond as well. It's weighing up how you deploy your time between the operational and the pedagogical. There are things that have absolutely got to be done in order for us to be open to whoever we're open to safely. So you've got your staff rotas, your one-way systems, the dinners, your risk assessments, all of those things. But actually they can become really, really consuming and aren't always necessarily the bit where the job satisfaction really, really comes from. And actually making time for the pedagogical, so looking at your lesson frameworks, spending time with the team to develop the pedagogical practice and the sharing of resources and experience. I think that's where the job satisfaction comes from. That's where the classroom practitioners particularly feel the impact of leadership most. And certainly on a personal note, it's where my greatest kind of pleasure of the job comes from. And it's not to mean to say you do more of one at the expense of the other necessarily, but striking that balance of the two as a leader, I found incredibly difficult. And I think, yeah, as we return to normality and the way of operating that we have done more of before, it's going to give us that opportunity to spend more time thinking about the pedagogical and developing those resources that we've begun to deploy in this way further into our curriculum, looking more at the hybrid models. So I just thought I'd share that thought as we finish. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to come back to the chat now and stop sharing, and I'm more than happy to take any questions. I hope that's been useful.
One question for me, actually. When thinking about the data, it occurred to me that perhaps I was making the mistake of thinking of data as only the type of things that I find in a spreadsheet. Would you say that data can be considered to be the quality of teaching, the well-being of staff?
Yeah.
Do those things, do you think?
Absolutely. And I think there's a danger with spreadsheets, particularly, that we try and quantify the unquantifiable. So, you can assign a numerical value to the well-being of staff, but actually, I would say that's sometimes a mistake. I mean, obviously, we have to do it for survey purposes and such, and that is useful in its own right. But within a school, as a leader, it's a bit like kind of, wetting your finger and sticking it in the air, isn't it, to find out which way the wind's going. You pick up on those non-verbal cues, you pick up on the mood, all of those things that we do as leaders in schools. That's all data. It's not ones, twos and threes in a spreadsheet, but it's key, and it does inform our decision making. An example would be, I had a phase meeting the other week where I was desperate to look at this sequence of lessons for an English lesson, but I knew by the end of the day, through my emails, through the people I'd seen in school, that it wasn't the right day. If I wanted to land that successfully and get some really good critical thinking, what I actually needed to do that day was give those people time in their own year groups rather than as a phase. And that was holding data at the center of my decision making. So I think it's a really good point, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Finn. And it got me thinking. Hugh was here before, who's the CEO actually, and he made a point that if it's okay, I'm just gonna read it out. He said the key point is whether the data comes before or after the decision, which sounds glib, he said, but shows whether we are engaging with an open or closed mind. Yeah. And often in our sector, data is used defensively after decisions have already been made. And it got me thinking, yeah, how much are we making decisions in an SLT, perhaps without having all the data, and then posthumously defending that decision? So yeah, I thought it was a good point to bring up.
Definitely. In that explore phase of the EEF implementation cycle, there is key, isn't it? Actually, as part of that exploration, it may be that we need to conduct some research that generates data in order to make an informed decision about what it is that's going to be our key priority that's amenable to change. It's no good just changing something and seeing whether the effect in the data is what you hoped it would be. I think you've got to be more strategic than that.
Yeah, agreed. Just going to stop the recording now, everyone. And